1800 BC, Mesopotamia. In the inner ranks of the powerful Anunnaki, the divine chief priests from Sumerian mythology, tensions and rivalries arose between the moon cult and the sun cult followers. These tensions eventually escalated into an epic conflict, the battle between good and evil, in a massive battle at Larsa, a major site in Mesopotamia. There were 100,000 poor, destitute beggars and savages living in Mesopotamia. They were looking for someone who could explain to them how the world works. Now you are highly religious fanatics who are born, live, and die only for the cult. Whether poor or rich, they have divested themselves of all possessions and worship the gods, represented by the Anunnaki chief priests. Dressed in rags and armed with stones, they pelted each other brutally, until no one could stand anymore. For the highly fanatical cult followers, retreat was out of the question. They fought to the last man, until death, because you were afraid of the sun. The Anunnaki, once united in their rule over the Sumerians, now found themselves caught in a massive power game. The moon cult, whose followers were inspired by the mysterious magic of the moon and fertility, and the sun cult, whose followers were afraid of the sun, mobilized their armies of cult followers and slaves for the inevitable conflict between good and evil and world domination over all minions. The typical cult follower has no possessions. He doesn't need any. He was born for the cult. He should only do what the gods tell him, a hollow, dry soul. The fanatical lackeys gathered in rags. They wielded rusty daggers and their eyes shone with an eerie determination to please their gods. The Battle of Larsa began with an ominous rumble as cultists from both sides clashed. Rocks flew through the air as the minions skillfully used improvised projectiles and feces to gain the favor of their respective deities. The earth shook under the furious dance of the fanatics. The vast plains outside the walls of Larsa shook with the footsteps of tens of thousands of fanatical cultists sent into battle by Hammurabi and Rim-Sin to fulfill their religious duty. In honor, King Rim-Sin the Moon Bull is the last remnant of the Akkadian kingdom. Sargon of Akkad once threw the remaining gods out of the Sumerian cities with the help of the moon goddess Ishtar. He freed the cities from the gods and thus also from the temple priests. The Anunnaki god priests were banished to Syria, to Canaan. One day in Syria, Hammurabi came from Jamchad, where Noah landed and founded a sinister cult of the weather god, Al-Hadad. Hammurabi allied himself with the city-state of Mari, which was known for its blacksmithing skills, to finally destroy Larsa for the gift of the goddess. But Larsa was supposedly defended by 40,000 soldiers. Hammurabi is called by a divine mission. He is the first knight. He is the chosen one and needs more cult followers. He needs all of you to end the dark machinations in Sumer and save the world. Both parties recruited their lackeys by the thousands. These fanatical warriors, dressed in rags and filled with an unshakable faith in a better life and the afterlife, had taken to the battlefield to fight for their gods. The situation is serious. The world will end if they don't win. No better life, no life after death. End of the world. In the dusty plains outside the ancient city of Larsa, the armies of Hammurabi and Rim-Sin rose, dressed in rags and filled with fanatical faith. The sun cast its hot rays onto the battlefield as the warriors formed up in eerie silence. Their simple but deadly armament consisted of carefully collected stones carved with mythical symbols and carried in improvised bags. Hammurabi and Rim-Sin's armies brutally attacked each other. The cultists held simple stones in their hands, their eyes averted from the sun and imbued with a fanatical glow. Your command, stone unbelievers. The order to attack was given and the first throws flew through the air. Stones slammed into shields, shattered armor, and struck their target in the ranks of enemy warriors. Hammurabi was able to recruit 2 heavy companies with his allies from Mari, Yamchad, and Syria. The heavily armored infantry differed greatly from the ragged lackeys and have-nots. These warriors fought for gold or power. They were well equipped with bronze shields, bronze armor, and bronze helmets, and were among the elite. The armor provided plenty of protection from the hail of stones. Hammurabi also led 2 mounted companies and led his heavily armored riders at the forefront of the battle. Hammurabi filled up the rest with fanatics and lackeys. Rim-Sin sent one of his generals. He led a mounted company and the legendary warriors from ancient Babylonian myths, the Lulubi band. A fierce band from the mountains of Ashur, consisting of 2 companies of heavy and light infantry, trained to advance together and encircle their victims. These warriors were better armed than those of Hammurabi. They had iron helmets and their spears had iron tips. They decorated their helmets like chickens and were considered invincible. Rim-Sin also increased his army with cult followers by the thousands. The decisive battle developed in the center of the violent tsunami between 2 tree hills. The minions armed with stones sought in vain protection from the stones on both sides and found some of it behind the trees. As the Lulubi band advanced deep into the enemy fanatic ranks, Hammurabi gathered his minions at Tree Hill and gave them one last word of courage and an afterlife before the final decisive attack. He had only 1 heavy company left and called for the attack. This was supposed to advance with the help of the other lackeys and destroy the enemy. Meanwhile, Hammurabi had to repeatedly fend off attacks from the Lulubi gang. These were superior to the simple minions, and Hammurabi's job was to protect his followers. The heavily armed warriors were severely thinned on both sides, until only a few remained, fighting for their lives. Daggers flashed in the sunlight and small axes whirled through the air as the fanatical warriors charged at one another. The dust of battle mingled with the blood of the fallen as the cultists fought with relentless fervor for their gods. Every blow, every stab, was accompanied by a deep belief in their gods. The battle was a veritable storm of chaos and death. Rags became makeshift bandages for wounds, and the earth shook under the constant pounding of the combatants. The scene was one of bloody frenzy and an ominous will to win. A menacing roar echoed across the battlefield as the 2 armies clashed. The ground shook under the rapid footsteps of the fanatical warriors, their rags flapping in the wind as they pelted each other with stones. The stones flew wildly through the air like deadly projectiles as the warriors fearlessly made their way through the dust and chaos. Hammurabi's followers fought with fierce determination, their faces suffused with a fanatical glow. They only knew one sentence: "Yes, mister," and were afraid of the sun. They always kept their eyes down and aimed low. Rim-Sin's warriors, however, were equally determined to defend their city. In order to maximize their army capacity, they worshipped the fertility cult, and as a reward there was sex, as well as 66 virgins after death. The battle became a desperate struggle for survival, with every throw of a stone sealing a warrior's fate. It was clear that the losers would all die for heresy. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing stones, cries of war, and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. The ground around Larsa was littered with rags, dust, and the remains of fanatical warriors. The sun began to dip towards the horizon as the battle reached its climax. The stones rushed through the air, crushing shields, shattering armor, and finding their targets in the ranks of the enemy warriors. A deafening clang and clap filled the scene, accompanied by the shrill screams of the fanatics. But despite the hail of stones, the warriors refused to take a step back. As the minions' supplies of stone were exhausted, an oppressive silence fell over the battlefield. The cult followers of Hammurabi and Rim-Sin stood face to face and, based on an ancient temple pact, they simultaneously emptied their hands of the improvised projectiles. Then the second phase of the battle began. Now the battle turned into hand-to-hand combat. Daggers met axes, and the skies above Larsa lit with sparks from the conflict-filled clash. The divine Anunnaki, who once ruled over humanity as a unit, now found their followers caught in a violent play of the elements. After the stone supplies were exhausted, a grim silence fell over the battlefield. An eerie crunch sounded as the fanatical warriors drew their daggers and small axes. The atmosphere became even more threatening as the armies engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The dust swirled as the warriors charged at each other with unparalleled abandon. Despite serious wounds or the loss of arms and legs, the madmen lashed out wildly. Nobody was safe anymore. Daggers flashed in the brilliant sunlight and small axes swung in a deadly dance. Every blow was accompanied by a sheer desire for superiority and the will to win. The battle took a cruel turn as the warriors were locked in deadly hand-to-hand combat. Rags became makeshift bandages for the wounds, and the ground was littered with the remains of the fanatical warriors who fought to the last breath. Finally, as the sun sank behind the craggy walls of Larsa, the battlefield lay silent and deserted. Those who still breathed were stained with blood and filled with unshakable faith. The battle between Hammurabi and Rim-Sin at Larsa would go down as a dark chapter in the chronicles of antiquity, marked by fanatical zeal and an unstoppable will to die in battle. Despite the exhaustion and losses, the fanatical warriors fought to the last man. Those who could still stand continued their desperate struggle, ready to sacrifice their lives for the faith and their gods. In the end, the battlefield was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind across the plains of Larsa. At the end of the day, when the dust settled and the stars appeared in the sky, the battlefield of Larsa lay littered with the remains of the fanatical warriors. The Anunnaki, once worshipped as gods, had lost their followers in a massive conflict. The inner differences of the gods had forever shaped the destinies of people on Earth. Hammurabi was ultimately able to win all battles and conquer Larsa. The world is saved, he has driven away evil. And with that the old Babylonian Empire was founded. Hammurabi emerged victorious from the conflict and conquered Sumer. He had the remaining fanatics crucified or imprisoned and introduced the Code of Hammurabi. The rest of Rim-Sin's followers fled northeast over the mountains and drew the bow. But this is another story. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest written legal texts that goes back to a single ruler. He was founded by Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon in the 18th century BC. Enacted. The Code of Hammurabi is engraved on a stone monument and contains a total of 282 laws that regulate various aspects of civil, economic, and family life. Here are some examples of provisions from the Code of Hammurabi. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is one of the most famous provisions in the Code of Hammurabi and is often interpreted as a principle of retribution. It means that the punishment for a crime should correspond to the harm caused to the victim. Property rights. The code contains laws that govern ownership and trade, including theft and fraud. There are clear regulations and penalties for thieves. Family matters. The code also regulates family relationships and matters such as marriage, divorce, and paternity. It also contains provisions for the protection of women and children. Occupational law. There are laws that relate to employment contracts and pay. The code also contains regulations for craftsmen and builders. Religious provisions. Some laws in the code are religious in nature and regulate people's behavior regarding cult and religious practices. It is important to note that the punishments in the Code of Hammurabi are often drastic and differ from modern legal concepts. However, the Codex is an important historical document that provides insights into the jurisprudence and social life of ancient Mesopotamia. If you don't want to miss the next epic battle then, you know and leave a like. See you next time.